Okay, it's three past. So, good evening, everyone. And today, what we're going to be doing is that I'm going to have my colleague Krishna, who's basically joined us as the CISO of our company. He's going to basically walk you through demystifying the entire process of compliance. We'll also walk you through what does it really mean. And when we're talking about demystifying, we basically are just going to walk through how simple it is to essentially achieve compliance if we essentially follow certain steps. And post that, we'll take any questions on this, etc. And if we basically, we'll be continuing with other things like the product updates, etc. next week. But this week, I thought it'll be good if basically Krishna walks through this. So Krishna, up to you. Can you please share the screen and start?
Thanks, Shiva. I'll just share my screen now. Hello, everyone. Good morning to you. So my name is Krishna. I just joined Connect Secure a few weeks ago, and I play the role of CISO. So as a starting point, we discussed with Shiva, and we said we'll probably put something through across to the partners to demystify compliance, because as you know, the compliance demands in the market are increasing with the increasing threat landscape. So we'll try to see how we can simplify the overall approach for compliance so that jointly we can transfer that value to our customers who have multiple compliance requirements as we go forward. Okay. So in a nutshell, if you look at it at a high level, what is the objective of a compliance? I mean, it's basically to ensure that there is confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the triads of security enforced on all the components that form an organization. May it be human resources, you have the IT systems, the control systems, the finance, and with the monitoring and control and feedback to measure on how effective these controls are. So this, pictorial representation is a very high level of what compliance is about. Because if you look at the market, many of the people who are advocates of compliance, they focus on the IT controls, ignoring the other aspects of an organization like your HR, your finance, and other process that support the IT. So that's why I put it forward that it's not just IT, it's everything around IT and the people who are required for a compliance. Okay. Now, debunking compliance. If you approach compliance from a totally common man's approach, compliance is nothing but doing structure, using some common sense in the things we do. The way I say that and why I put it in that simplistic manner is because if a business is running, if an organization is running, may it be a healthcare business, may it be a consulting business, may it be a financial business, it would have certain checks and balances already in place, which can contribute to the compliance posture of an organization. So most of these regular business as usual activities contribute to compliance. A classic example for it is a HR background verification. So you will not hire someone in an organization who has a criminal record, and that is business as usual for any organization. And that is one of the one of the requirements for a SOC 2 compliance. So unknowingly or knowingly, you are actually doing that activity, but not under the umbrella of compliance. The other thing might be, you will always have in your process, in your financial system, you will always have a maker and checker. So the person who is requesting for a payment is not the approver for the payment. You have a proper mechanism in place that will establish a well-defined org structure and segregation of duties within the organization, which in turns mandates that you have a structured organization structure that will make your organization work. So the point I'm trying to drive home here is that you already have these controls built into your system, and what you need to do to translate that the benefits out of these controls into compliance is to adopt a structured methodology in the overall process. You dedicate your time and effort to see that these controls are in place. Now, compliance doesn't mean that getting it once and forgetting it. The main focus of compliance is to have all the evidences of the tests that you make available. Now, it's always possible that you would have gaps to meet certain compliance. You have to make sure that you identify those gaps and close them. And always, you can always go back to reference to the best practices that are available. So this is, simplifying the compliance requirements into a common man's language is what I've done here. Now, we mentioned about the non-IT process. Sorry,
Krishna,
hello.
1 second. I just wanted to go back to the previous slide. So while I understand the concept of you saying that compliance is common sense and basically it is what is required, what we usually find in the field is essentially that is a common thing that we always say common sense is not so common. So because of various factors, what we know is basically ideally required basically gets bypassed. So for example, basically where people can actually think, how many times have you had employees with basically bad antecedents and you hired people basically because of a reference and without doing a complete reference check? So these are things which normally happen in an organization. The whole, I think, idea of what you do when you put a compliance framework together is basically make sure that you stay within those boundaries. So it's a lot of things that we know that we have to do, but we essentially kind of bypass those things either because of shortage of time, or we essentially believe that it becomes like owner of a company basically decides that he knows it better, so it's okay. So whatever it is. So what compliance does is to basically remove the element of a human and his what you would say as intuition into the entire system and bring it into a measurable framework so that we can essentially kind of take this common sense and basically make it it can basically be demonstrated. B, it basically is something that I think for most people, including the businesses, it's a valid thing to keep so that they can essentially keep their cyber insurance down. And third, it is to essentially kind of demonstrate to anyone in case of any breach, etc., that we've done our level best in order to prevent the breach. Otherwise, what's going to happen is these small mistakes that people make in terms of not following certain best practices. So most of this was earlier talked of in the terms of best practices, because if you look at it 10 to 12 years back, there were very few compliances, but there were a lot of these best practices. Now, best practices, the problem is that it is a best practice, which is you can choose to follow it or you may choose not to follow it, right? So now with compliances coming in and the requirement for compliances, the need that's come in is because they want to enforce these rules so that you can be measured on a common framework, which says that, okay, if I have 3 people who are coming in for an evaluation, whom should I choose? The guy who basically has the compliances will probably get chosen ahead of the ones who don't have the compliances, even though their workmanship might be better. And the reason for that is I have a guarantee that essentially they have followed the processes to get over there, right? So, and this is the same with what we did, right? When a lot of you essentially, thanks to all of you, you essentially told us you want us to demonstrate that whatever we are talking about in terms of the process that we follow and the integrity of the data that we provide you is valid. And the way that we can prove that to you is essentially by getting the SOC 2 Type 2 certification. So we went and did that entire process, and we were able to get that certification without any exceptions. And that is how we can demonstrate to you that we are basically a valid company, and basically we are following, we follow what we preach. And that is exactly the scenario that you will essentially need to basically demonstrate from your side to the customers, but also the customers being able to demonstrate it to their customers. And it might be very small businesses to basically fairly large businesses. All of them have this requirement today.
Shiva, thank you. Thank you, Shiva. Shall I move forward?
Yeah, please.
Yeah,
Certainly.
sure. Now, when you look at the common control process, we talked about the non-IT related process like HR verifications, finance process approval, and stuff like that. But if you look at the common control process that exists in an IT operational environment, these are the standard process that is common across most and all of the standards. I'll show the mapping in a later slide. But if you look at it, all these processes might exist in some fashion in most of the operating environments of technology. Okay. Now, if each of these processes implement very minimal modifications on what they do, or validate minimal modifications on how it's executed, there is a lot of advancement in the compliance posture. For example, an access control network implementing proper VLANs, because if you look in a regular environment, you would probably see that the admin network, the production network, everything is on the same VLAN. Everyone has access to everybody else's data. Then you would find user access validation. You would find users who have left the organization who still has a valid login and password available on the network. Now, account management, some people might have asked, some people from the development team might have asked for a production access or a server access, which is still valid, which are highly privileged account. The configuration of each of the assets are not updated. Most of the changes that have been made on the systems, there is no traceability. There is no audit trail, which is very key in that. Then one common that you find across most of the end customers are data classification, because there is no defined custodian for the data. They don't know whether the data is confidential, the data is top secret, whatever classification they need to be. Patch management still is a big issue that you see across many organizations, because some people cannot patch because they are worried, or they have this fear that their product might not work if the patch level is upgraded. Some people do not patch because they think it's not important. Some of the end users don't patch. So this patch management is across. Now, of course, the monitoring of network and infrastructure is more advanced when you look at the other aspects. And also proper risk management practice and sign-off is something that, so these activities, I mean, these are just baby steps that can improve your compliance posture to a higher level. And these artifacts, once maintained, can lead to artifacts that can be submitted for any of these compliance certifications. Now, if you look at the compliance standards across industry verticals and across geo-specific compliance, there are a lot in the market. I mean, there are a lot of compliance requirements that have come over a period of years, and I'm sure there will be more to come. So there are certain that are specific to certain industry vertical. There are certain that are specific to certain geo compliances. So first and foremost, as a partner, as an MSP, and as someone who has an advisory role to the customer, is to identify what exactly is my requirement, or what exactly is my customer's requirement when it comes to compliance, before we jump into the standards and we run behind the standards. So first, you should be able to answer this question: who am I? I mean, as a customer, who am I? And what is my compliance requirement? What are my focus areas for that specific compliance? So if you look at it, I'm a healthcare provider providing, processing healthcare data. So my compliance requirement is HIPAA, and what does HIPAA focus on? I deal with credit card information. PCI-DSS is my requirement. I process data for EU citizens, so GDPR is my requirement. Then I have, I provide financial product and services, GLBA's requirement. So understanding the customer's compliance requirement rather than going with a set of controls and asking him to work on it is the first step when we have to advise the customer on what the correct requirement of compliance is, or what are the remediation activities that he needs to perform. Okay. Now, of course, there are best practice frameworks that you can always refer to. So the best practice framework cuts across, it's independent of the compliance. These are all best practices. There are control domains that can contribute to certain parameters in the compliance. So out of these best practices from an IT point of view, ISO 27000 has the most widespread controls that can impact several control domains. Okay, so I'll just change the control mapping. I'll just share the control mapping with you.
So I just want to bring one piece into this, right? So if you really look at it in the previous slide, essentially what was demonstrated is compliances, which essentially are bound with a certain certification. And then once you get that certification, there are certain things that you can essentially kind of accomplish with those certifications. Those are those kind of certifications. The second set of certifications that Krishna actually demonstrated are all basically fall in the category of best practices. For example, let's take CIS, right? Now, you can essentially be CIS compliant. That essentially gets you into a phase which is called CIS compliant, but it does not check your box in terms of any of the required compliance frameworks, like, for example, an ISO 27002 or basically CMMC or any of those, which essentially are auditable frameworks. The But however, all of these auditable frameworks use most of the controls which are present in these specific best practices documents, which are like CIS or ISO 27001, etc. And that's the entire model in which basically these operate, right? So there are auditable controls and not auditable controls. And Krishna, I don't know if you're covering this, but essentially they are country-specific controls also. So there
Yeah,
are
so,
things like Essential 8 and basically like Cyber Essentials, which are specific to a particular country. Now, how does it operate in that particular country? Now, the problem with the country-specific specifications are those are specific to a country, but they are very broad-based, right? So they do not have any specific depth of character in terms of a particular industry. So what happens is you have to take Cyber Essentials and then you have to couple it with something else in order to be able to be fully compliant with, say, if I am if I'm dealing with medical equipment, then whatever is Cyber Essentials plus HIPAA basically needs to be taken care of. So you will have to play with one or more standards in order to get fully compliant. And it may not be just one particular compliance that will basically get you through in a number of cases.
Thanks, Shiva. I've just shown this as a compliance standard. You have Cyber Essential and Cyber Essential Plus, GDPR, and Essential 8, which are a geo-specific compliance. Okay, and in the controls comparison sheet, what we've done is, if you go back to the controls comparison sheet, we have taken the control domains and shown the mapping of those specific control domains to each of these compliance requirements. Also, out of which SOC 2, PCI-DSS are two certifications that we can go through. But the ISO 27002 stretches across, covering all the domains, and it makes sure that there are minimal controls available for all these domains that they're talking about, and their corresponding mapping to those certifications, what we have tried to attempt in this controls domain mapping. Shiva, does this answer the question that you had raised about coverage?
Yeah. And could we go through those, at least a few of those controls to broadly talk about what would essentially be entailed in order to essentially get compliant? Because I want to
Sure.
say to everyone that it's not all that difficult, right? So
No, it's not actually. Let's look at the common one. This common one is information security policies and procedure. Okay, that's a control domain. So if you look at the ISO implementation manual, ISMS manual, it gives a lot of stress on the policies and procedures and guidelines for information security management at a high level. But if you break it down, then it requires you to have a policy for, you should have a patch management, you should have a backup and policy, you have a data classification policy. So it covers a gamut of policies that you need to implement in your organization if you're implementing ISO 27000. Now, what would this contribute to? What would this contribute to when you take it in the context of a SOC 2 certification? In the SOC 2 certification, say you have implemented ISO, you have successfully maintained the certification, you have a need for a SOC 2 certification. So when you are going for a SOC 2 certification, in your initial assessment, what you would submit for the auditors to get certified are your policies that you've already created for ISO, which gives a coverage of what is, because the ask for SOC 2 is policies and procedures that address the security, availability, processing, integrity, and confidentiality and privacy of data. So your data classification, your backup and recovery process, your patch management process, your availability management, and your business continuity are the processes that you submit for the SOC 2. And when it comes to GDPR, it's the classification of data. So along with this, we'll go for your access control policy and your user access management. So, and if you look at the PCI-DSS, it's exactly a similar set, because it also focuses on incident response. So incident response should be your incident management process and your security incident management process, which comes under the information security policy and procedure. Now we have similar because incident management and response is highlighted separately, because there is a separate highlighting for that requirement in the GDPR requirement and PCI-DSS. So this is how, if you have a basic control system in place, all these artifacts that you have for that control implementation can be reused across standards for across getting you certified and compliant in these requirements. Okay. So going back to the slides. So as if we have to summarize the controls across different areas of operations in an organization, you have the administrative, you have the financial controls, you have the IT controls, you have the physical security, which gets, which actually Usually in some certification, it's considered as a part of access control, but in some, it's specifically considered as a separate control by itself for testing. Then you have the controls that have been implemented specifically for compliance and your risk management controls. So how do we start with? How do we start with your compliance process? Because compliance process is not a one-time activity. It's a continuous cycle that whatever you do now, it has to be repeatable, and you need to maintain artifacts for that repeated activity. So as I mentioned earlier in the previous slides, we cannot, there are so many compliance requirements that are there in the market now and that might come up. We have to understand the customer requirement, or from as a partner, you have to understand the customer requirement to see where do I stand, or help them to answer the question, who am I and what is my compliance need? Do business in. As we said, that there are some geography specific compliance requirements that they need to comply. Now, as mentioned before, you need not start from scratch. They will have some minimal internal controls in place, and you have to help them map those internal controls into a matrix. Now, if you look at, as a partner, if you look at your complete customer base and see, and if you can map the complete all the customer compliance requirements into a matrix, that will be a good place to start with, saying that, okay, these set of customers require this compliance, these set of customers require these kind of compliance. And if you will let us know about those customer requirements, that will help us prioritize releasing the templates and frameworks that we can offer together to the customers to make this journey smoother and faster. Shiva, if you want to add something on this, please.
No, I'm good. So essentially what we want to essentially do is kind of get this whole compliance piece, something that basically we can hand off to you in terms of being able to kind of look at your customer, basically look at what compliances they require and essentially make them compliant. And this way, what happens is it reduces the risk that you basically carry in terms of managing that customer. And second is that it also basically improves the customer's visibility into the entire process to say that, yeah, I'm compliant with this particular standard. So it also basically gives them the confidence that you're giving them a compliance which they require. And they also basically can essentially kind of say that I am protected adequately because of the controls that basically this particular compliance is bringing it together.
So how do we sell this to a customer? So we have to, first, the first and the foremost thing we can do is to get yourself compliant. You know, as service providers, you can get yourself compliant to certain standards. That would be that would cover ideally or theoretically, the compliance that you would get should be a superset of the controls that all your customer base would require. For example, any situation where the customer wants an audited report from your side for their compliance requirement, then it should have the superset of controls that the customer might require. Okay. Now, understanding the customer needs, understanding the customer compliance needs is the next step. So basically, you understand which vertical they are aligned to, what is their current compliance posture, and what is the additional thing required. And based on that, we can create the templates and the frameworks on the tools that they can use to take this journey forward, and also sustain that process by helping them to maintain the compliance as an ongoing activity, as an ongoing compliance. So basically, these are the steps we have identified that we should be doing to support the customer for compliance. So as MSPs, you get yourself compliant, then you identify specific customer need for compliance. That's from Cyber Seniors, we create tools and templates and framework for customer needs based on the prioritization. Let's say you have 20 out of 100 customers, 50 of them are PCI-DSS. So the priority would be on getting those customer PCI-DSS compliant and the required tools and templates to get certified and also to maintain the certification. Another set of MSPs, the main customers, they have a SOC 2 requirement. So the templates would be for SOC 2 and the tools that we prioritize would be on that basis. So once we onboard them on the compliance journey, you have to be with them throughout and get the customer certified. And we will make sure that there is enough tools and frameworks available for this journey and to continue this. So the next.
One thing, Krishna, I just want to go back. So the idea behind this whole thing that we are putting together is essentially like, I know that today, basically, the whole compliance industry is basically mostly reactive, right? So when your customer says that I want to essentially get this certification, that is when you essentially start the process of saying that, okay, I'm going to get this certification and I'm going to get it done. So it's basically more customer driven in terms of saying, when the customer approaches, you approach it. However, I think what we're going to see going forward is that it has to be something that has to be driven from you and basically from the MSP themselves, in terms of trying to essentially educate the customer and tell them that they essentially require this compliance, bake it into the entire service model that you have, and make it one of the deliverables. So when you have them compliant with whatever framework that you have, at a base level, you could essentially get them an ISO 27002 certification, and we can help you with that entire process to do so. And when I'm saying we can help you with the entire process, I'm talking about end to end, from the time when we basically do the assessment, and then after the assessment, basically we can help you out with what you should do to remediate all of those things, and basically then getting them audited, so that essentially the results from the tool are taken to an auditor, and the auditor basically audits it and provides a certificate. So we can essentially kind of help you with that entire journey and basically make it highly cost effective for you, where you can have intelligent and good markup with your customers. And in that case, what happens is that when you basically go to the customers, and if your customers are able to display their certifications in terms of their compliance with different standards, then it shines on you, because you essentially are keeping them compliant. And because you have followed the best practices, there are two things that basically come out of it, right? One is essentially the entire amount that you spend on cyber insurance falls dramatically. And that is something that we want to work on with you to see how we can basically bring that down. The second thing is that the point is that we can all basically assume that we will never get hacked, right? But the point is that the best of us can get hacked. And all of you know that even last week, for example, Azure had an extreme DDoS attack, which basically brought down a number of things. Now, these things happen and these cannot be prevented. And anybody who basically says that I'm not going to get hacked because I have the best infrastructure, basically is fooling themselves, because it's only a matter of time when somebody will train their guns against us, and some misconfiguration will open up. However, if as an MSP and as a provider, you are able to demonstrate that you have had and basically employed enough of controls and basically audited all of the systems to an extent that you have done everything that you could protect that particular system, then essentially any litigations or any such things which happen where the client basically, see, whenever there is basically an attack, and then the client immediately blames the MSP, saying that you guys didn't protect me, right? That's the first reaction that most of your customers have. Now, the point is that by doing this, you essentially demonstrate to them, saying that I've done everything that is possible, that is within the viable scope of what I can basically think of. Now, beyond this, basically, it is equivalent to what airlines call act of God, right? So in every insurance has this, it's act of God, you cannot do anything. And that would essentially be the act of a smart hacker. In that particular case, you cannot essentially be held liable, or even if there is something, basically it has to be very minor. But this demonstration of the fact that you have essentially helped them be compliant, and keeping that documentation and having that documentation ready to go is very critical, especially if you get into any kind of litigation situations. And that is where we want to make sure that each of you have this experience, and basically we provide the tools so that you can essentially keep these in place and essentially deliver it to the customer when it is required.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Shiva.
So just quickly like to draw your attention to a few questions on chat. I think Chris has a valid point that if we could make the effort to map specific features in Cyber CNS and Connect Secure back with some of these controls, it will be valuable. I think, Chris, that's great idea. And then Dennis, Shiva, I just want to go through that with Krishna.
Yeah. So many of the controls or administrative controls or even physical controls will be their ability to upload policies, documentation, images. So actually, Dennis, yes, that is essentially what we are doing right now. And actually, we basically have already enrolled Chris Blunt into this whole effort, where we're actually creating the complete compliance wizards within this, where we can upload it and store assessments. We've gotten a lot of feedback from Chris, and we're working through that feedback. In fact, a lot of this essentially is coming back from that. And then after that, we're basically going to come to a couple of you, which is who are interested, like you, Dennis, and then Carl. I've already enrolled Carl into this. We're going to come back to you to essentially see how we can apply this to other standards and basically bring this out completely as a module where you can essentially keep this as a repository, which can then be used not just for this, but as I said, in case there is a breach, then how do you basically get the entire documentation which is valid for any litigation? If there is basically any questions that anybody asks you from an audit perspective, how do you deliver those documents and basically get audited? So this is exactly what we are essentially trying to cover from a product perspective. And Chris, I agree. So we are taking your feedback very seriously. We are working on it, and we will map every single thing that we have into this controls. Plus, we are building those wizards, which essentially will have all this data and store the audit data as we move forward.
Shall we proceed?
Yeah, please, Krishna.
Yeah, please.
All right. So the next most important area that we come across when we talk about compliance is exception. So let's take a classic example. I mean, any exception is a violation from compliance. Okay, so a classic example that you might find in many of the environments are machines running Windows 7, Windows, worst cases, Windows 98, Windows NT, and they might have some critical application or a service, maybe a payroll application or maybe a job card application running on them, which they don't want to upgrade or patch. And this usually becomes an exception to when you do a compliance activity exercise to test the compliance, this becomes an exception. An exception gets approved first time, second time, third time, it continues to be in the system. Such exceptions are a big no-no when it comes to compliance to any standards. Because what would eventually happen is the blame would go on because they are taking service from certain MSPs. The MSPs would be held liable for such an exception. But customer security exception ideally should be formally signed off with the highest authority of the customer, accepting the risks and clearly articulating that there is no liability to the MSP, and all communications back and forth related should be documented. Should there be any case of compromise, let's say many people might run, they will say that we'll put the Windows 98 server or Windows 7 server behind a firewall, but what if there's a shared file share on that is shared by someone, which causes a malware to enter the network? So there are a lot of things that could happen with it by trying to circumvent the actual requirement for this exception. So the authorization of the exception and the visibility of the exception to the highest level of the management is mandatory, so that as MSPs, you are not made responsible for any of the compromise that has happened due to the customers' exceptions.
So we had a situation over here where basically one of the customers essentially had a lathe machine, which basically, so it has a terminal attached to it, which is basically a Windows 7 PC. Now, as you know, Windows 7 has not been patched for a year. Now, the problem with that is basically when they did the assessment, they essentially wrote down saying that this is not connected to the internet, so it does not matter, right? So, however, what essentially happened was that this machine, the Windows 7 machine that was over there, essentially was like people used to essentially come with CAD drawings, which essentially they would insert using a USB. It got infected because of basically the some sort of malware that was sitting on the USB. Once it got infected, and since it was basically there was a file share on that Windows 7 machine from where they were essentially kind of using it to basically make copies of the CAD drawings on another PC, which was there in the network. Essentially, they were copying. So over SMB, it essentially replicated, which is a standard Mitre attack framework replication. And then once it replicated over there, and then basically it downloaded ransomware, and essentially all of the systems over there basically got infected at that point of time. Now, while it was a mitigating control which said that it's not connected to the internet and it's isolated, what people failed to see was the fact that it was connected to other systems. And unfortunately, over here, it did not even have the proper VLANs, the proper VLANs were not set. So because of which, essentially, it was in one broadcast domain, and it was essentially be able to kind of traverse horizontally. So it's very important that when we do an assessment, we also look at other aspects of this whole thing, right? Like, what is the network architecture? Yeah, are the networks basically isolated? If it is not isolated, how are we doing it? And basically, if there are any exceptions, they are on a separate network, and that network should never be connected to any other network where any critical systems are there. So these are important, because a lot of times when we take exceptions, you might take an exception which says that, yeah, this Windows 7 machine, you are taking an exception. However, the Windows 7 machine may be the root of the problem, but other machines are infected. So you may get a question saying that, then what did you do? Because you said you took an exception for this machine, but what happened to the other machines? And that is the reason why we essentially are harping on this thing, that get the sign-offs from whatever people and basically isolate those non-compliant machines, make them sit as far away as possible from every other critical machine, and make sure that no traffic can flow between them. That's extremely critical. It may be a business requirement, it may be whatever requirement, but if that is a business requirement and they accept it, then they should accept the risk associated with that too, and not blame you when basically something goes wrong.
Right. So I've come to the last concluding slide of this presentation. So basically, what we are trying to say here is there's a huge market for compliance, which is valued at around 54,000 million as of 2023, and it's growing at a rate of 18% on an annual basis. So there is a lot of compliance requirements that are coming in the future. So just to hop onto this journey, you have to get yourself compliant and demonstrate the customer, and then go ahead and identify the relevant customers and their needs that they have specific to their industry or area of operation to get compliant. So be on top of your customers' ongoing compliance activities and your compliance status as well. So compliance, as I mentioned, is a journey and not a destination, and we are there with you on every step forward to support your customer and deliver value to the customer. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening to me. If there are any questions, I can take that now.
Yeah, and the only thing which I would like to add in this particular case is, look, folks, the point is that right now we are in an era where basically like everything, basically cyber is something that is cyber crime, and basically cyber insurance and all of these things are essentially coming to the fore. Now, one of the things that essentially will help you kind of mitigate your risk and help you kind of keep safe and this is honestly speaking, this is something that we realized when we were basically speaking to a lot of you, and we went through our own compliance journey, right? So when we went through our compliance journey, we fixed the gaps, we essentially got compliant, and we continue to keep compliant. Now we understood the process and basically kind of understood that there is nothing great to the process, but it is essentially, we have to apply a little bit of common sense. We have to apply a little bit of good behavior, and basically kind of stop taking ad hoc decisions at certain points of time, which probably helps the organization itself. Now, if you apply the same thing and basically get all your customers compliant, it saves you in two ways. One is essentially your own, you are also basically secured, because you know that the customer basically has been compliant with all the best practices that basically is industry wide. Second is that when somebody comes and questions you about a certain issue that occurs, you can always basically go back to these best practices and essentially provide evidence and proof. And Cyber CNS will basically, as a product, will essentially kind of evolve going forward to provide you with support for all of these pieces. And we welcome your feedback. And all I would say is that please use this to essentially kind of come back to us, let us know what you need. And as I said, this is our product is essentially, you are the product managers for this product, right? So you guys basically have to tell us what help you require, where you would essentially require us to move forward. Would you require content in terms of what you want to do with the customers? And as I said, last week also, I think quite a few of you reached out to Krishna and had meetings, and basically kind of, he has walked you through some of the compliance requirements, etc. But if you want more sessions, you want to basically understand something more about compliance, feel free to set up time with Krishna, and then we will basically take this forward.
Thanks, Shiva. So thank you everyone for your time. If there are any questions, you can raise now, or you can send an email across to me. Or you can, like Shiva said, we can, if there is a one-on-one sessions that are needed, you can send an email. We can set up a session during the week, anytime.
Dennis,
Thank you very much.
Just 1 second, Dennis, this thing, the V3 release is basically going to be released on July 7th is basically when we will be releasing the V3 release. I will basically send you early screenshots and everything basically by July 2nd, and then we'll basically release it on July 7th.
So I'll stop sharing the screen now.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just putting in the Krishna's email. It's krishna@connectsecure.com. So that's this thing. So perfect. So thank you very much. I think Krishna, thank you for your presentation today. And I think what we need to do,
Shiva.
kind of let's if there are partners who essentially would like to have more discussions, etc., let's engage them, and let's get all the requirements basically in place so that we essentially make this something that is exciting for everyone in this place.
Sure. Noted.
All right. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the day. I appreciate you all taking the time off to join the call. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Srikanth.
Thanks, Krishna.
Thank you.